QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022 Accounts Payable Aging Reports. Get ready because we bookkeeping pros are moving up the hilltop with QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022. Here we are in our free QuickBooks sample file, Sample Rock Castle Construction, going through the setup process with the View drop-down, the Open Windows list on the left-hand side, Company drop-down, Home page in the middle, maximizing that home page to the gray area. Opening up now the Financial Statement Reports drop-down on the Reports. Company and Financial, going on down to that Balance Sheet Standard Report, maximizing the font to 14, customizing reports to do so, going to the Fonts tab for font's sake, going to the Changed Font, making that font 14, okay, yes, and okay. Same thing with the Reports drop-down on the Profit and Loss, Company and Financial, P&L, Profit and Loss, otherwise known as the Income Statement. Font size 14, customizing report, Fonts and Numbers tab, font data down below, and we want that font where? At 14. Okay, yes, okay. Back to the balance sheet on the left-hand side in the open windows. We're now focusing in on the payable. Let's change the date up top. I'm going to customize the report, changing the date from, we're going to say 12/01/23 to 12/31/23. Run that report. Okay. And we're scrolling on down to the liabilities side this time, looking at that accounts payable account. Remembering that the balance sheet and income statement are the primary two financial statement account. All other reports, the ones we're focusing on now included, being subsidiary type reports, supporting in some way the number on or a number on the balance sheet and the income statement, typically providing more information related to them. These reports being in essence subsidiary reports, having a bottom line number that should tie out and add up to the accounts payable. The accounts payable then represents what we owe to vendors. They represent typically goods and services that we have then purchased, which we have not yet paid for and owe vendors for at some point in the future. The next question we would want to know about the accounts payable is, who are these vendors that we owe? To answer that question, we cannot simply go to the general ledger type of report, which we could do by double clicking, which is typically called the transaction by account report, that giving us more detailed, it being a form of ledger, a general ledger in essence, but it breaks out the detail by date. We don't want to see it by date necessarily, or typically. We want to see the added detail by who we owe the money to, and then further possibly breaking down that detail by who we owe the money to and how outstanding or how old are the bills that we have been entered that we have not yet paid. How long can we wait before we have to pay the bills, trying to maximize the holding on to our cash, which is the typical money management strategy, cash management strategies for a business. So I'm going to close this back out, and we're going to look at the reports that will supplement this account, remembering that if we work at a large company, then you might just work in the accounts payable department, in the purchasing department, for example, spending all the time managing the payables, determining which payables are due, when they're going to due, and trying to postpone payment on them as long as possible, which is typical money management type of strategy without being penalized for doing so. So then we're going to go to the reports dropdown. We can find these reports by going down to the vendor. They're going to be in the vendors and payables section. This is the way I would typically do it once I have a good understanding of the reports I'm working with. But for now, to get a good understanding, we're going to go to the Reports Center, Reports drop down to that Reports Center. So the default is the Standard tab, Company and Financial. We're going down to the Vendors and Payables at this point. And I like to see it in this format, which is the typical default format, the grid view, because that gives us a little look at what the reports will look like. The most common reports used, similar to the accounts receivable reports, are the AP aging reports, those being useful because they add that added dimension of how past due the bills are that we're going to have by the customer. There are other reports, the typical report we would think of most likely as a supplemental report, breaking out the vendors by who we owe, is information we can also find basically by going to the vendor dropdown and the vendor center. And if we want to know people that we particularly owe, we can hit the dropdown right here, and we could see we want the vendors with open balances, and then we can locate the vendors and work with the vendors that we owe to in that format as well. So that's why when we go to the reports center, typically the report that we're going to be generating for internal purposes are going to be more like the aging reports. But let's go through some of the other reports. We also have the accounts payable graph. We'll talk more about graphs in future presentations. We've got the vendor balances. Now, these is the summary balance and the detailed balance. These are probably the first reports that would come to mind if you were not familiar with working in the accounts payable department, the reports that would summarize the accounts payable broken out not by date but by vendor. So let's look at that one first. Opening up the vendor balance detailed report. Let's run the report from, let's make it 12/01/23 to 12/31/23. And so now we've got our list of vendors here totaling up to the 26,636.92. That should then sum up to what's on the balance sheet in the Open Windows tab, 26,636.92. So useful report, the vendor balance detail, giving us who owes us or who we owe the money to, so we could determine who we would have to actually pay the money to get that accounts payable to go down. Let's go back to the report center again. We also have the vendor balance detail, which gives us the same kind of information in a more detailed report. Also something we can typically find by going to the vendor center. But let's run that report. Could be useful to run it, to show it to other people and have it in like a meeting or something like that. So we would then have this running the date 12/01/23 to 12/31/23. So we have now the vendors and the detail related to them. We could see that the detail goes up, or the balance per vendor goes up with the bills. As we enter bills, they go back down when we pay the bills. That's the typical trend we would expect to see within the accounts payable. Easier to see when you see it on a vendor by vendor account, because the increases and the decreases are more likely to match up closer to themselves than in the accounts payable full general ledger or transaction detail account. Bottom line still adds up to that 26,636.92, which ties out, of course, to the balance sheet as well, or at least it should and generally will, because QuickBooks forces us basically to, every time we enter something to an accounts payable account, add the vendor detail to it, so that QuickBooks is going to be able to tie out the subsidiary reports to the general ledger report, which is kind of nice, but can also be tedious if you don't understand why QuickBooks will not let you post certain things when you're trying to do so to something that's going to post to an accounts payable account. QuickBooks is trying to help you out by not letting you post something that doesn't have a vendor related to it. Let's go back to the report center again. Those are going to be the first ones we would think of, but not the most common. The most common report probably going to be the accounts payable aging summary, because it adds that added dimension of having the past due amounts of ones that we should be paying sooner because they're past due. Otherwise, we might be getting penalized for them. So if we run this report, 12/31/23, what did I say, 23? 12/31/23. 12/31/23. It will look similar to the accounts receivable aging report. We got the same total on the right-hand side. We've got the same vendors, but it gives us that added dimension of detail, which is going to say, hey, look, these are the amounts that are still current. Hopefully, most of the stuff that we owe is current. Here's the stuff that is 1 to 30 days overdue, 31 to 60 days, 61 to 90, and over 90. So then in a larger company, you could spend a lot of time managing just your payables and determining which are due. Your goal is to increase the cash flow, oftentimes the cash flow being necessary, because if you get the cash flow and you increase the cash flow, you can use some of that cash to increase or grow the business, and therefore you want to hold on to, on the payable side, the cash as long as possible, which seems like not that big a deal when you're looking at one transaction at a time. But when the transactions multiply and you're talking about a whole lot of transactions, it becomes quite significant. If you look at credit card companies, for examples, they spend a lot of time just for small changes in their receivables and payables, basically to improve the cash flow. And in so doing, that can have a big impact on, the ability to grow the business, given the fact that you have freed up the cash in that way. So you could if the items become overdue, then of course the question is, can we change the terms? Can we re-up the terms? Can we pay it at that point in time? Are we going to be penalized for it? We also might have situations where particular vendors might give us particular discounts or some discounts if we pay at an earlier period of time. They, having the same kind of incentives from a cash management standpoint, would like to receive the money faster, so they might give a small discount to pay them faster. So we want to manage these kind of things and determine what vendors we're dealing with, try to stay in good standing with the vendors, but at the same time taking advantage of the ability to hold on to our cash as long as possible and maximizing the play between taking advantage of any kind of discounts that would apply to holding on to the cash for a longer period of time. So, but the bottom line, this will then tie out to, we could see once again the 26,636.92. Let's go back to the report center. We can then see the accounts payable aging detail report, running that one, checking it out, changing the date up top to 12/31/23 once again. And so now we've got most of our bills are in the current area. That's good. So because the due date is 12/31/23 and we have our information, all these are due by 2025 here. So let's change it to 24 up top just to make it a little bit more interesting of a report. So now we've got the current items up top. We've got the ones that are between 1 and 30 days overdue at this point in time. So for example, this item on 12/15 or is due on 12/30, and we're currently saying it's 12/31, so it's past due between 1 and 30 days, and so on, 31 to 60. So we can break down our information in that format as well. So we can then go back to the report center again. Those are the most common reports, most likely. We got our graph, which we'll talk about at a future point. We looked at the vendor balance reports here. We also have the unpaid bills, which is similar to the unpaid invoice report. We looked on the receivable side. Let's check it out. And we're going to say 12/31/23. So now we've got our information by the vendors, and we've got the bills that have not yet been paid, the total adding up to that 26,636.92 once again, which I believe was the amount on the balance sheet. So that is correct. That looks right. Note that if we look at this unpaid bills report, it's possible that we have some balance here that is different than what's on the balance sheet, because it's possible for us to post something, say with a journal entry or some other format, to the accounts payable as long as we apply a vendor, and then it wouldn't be a bill, but it would still be applied, and it would still be applied to the vendor, and that would result in a difference between the unpaid bills report and the accounts payable on the balance sheet. But in general, these reports should then tie out. This is also something that you can kind of manage on the report center, so internally, most of the time, not on the report center, but on the vendor center. You might be then choosing the vendors here and then using your filters in essence to determine the amounts that are going to be overdue or so on. You can then sort the data in that format as well. Let's go back to the report center again. Let's see what else we have. We got the transaction list by vendor. So if we run the transaction list by vendor and put the dates here from 12/1 to 12/31/23. So now we've got the activity basically that's happening on a vendor by vendor kind of transaction basis. So we've got, once again, the vendors happening here, or broken out the vendors and the activity for those vendors, the transaction activity for them, which will typically be bills and the bill payments. And so then we're going to go back to the report center. That's another thing that if you want to see that by customer, you might choose the vendor center most likely for internal purposes. Then we've got the 1099 summary and detail running this report. This is going to be a specialized report related to vendors that it looks like they don't have anything. Let's make it from 01/01/23 to 12/31/23. So this is a special report that you have to set up specially, basically telling the QuickBooks that you want, the particular vendors to be set up as vendors that you need to 1099 if they're under certain conditions, those being that you pay them over a certain dollar amount. I think it's really low, like $600 or something, and they're not a corporation, S corporation or C corporation, but rather a sole proprietorship, and that's kind of like a regulation thing for the government. And you could kind of sort your vendor report and try to figure out who you owe, or you could try to use the QuickBooks system to assign the vendors that you have as those that might be eligible or need a 1099. Then you can generate a report to help you to fill out your 1099 reports for your year-end tax filing reports requirements. You got the detailed report, similar kind of thing there. Then you got your sales tax liability report. This doesn't relate to the accounts payable, but rather to the sales tax payable. And you kind of see that with the sales tax widget as well. So if you went to the home page, we looked at these a little bit when we looked at that sales tax widget, and we saw those sales tax reports. And when we go in through and pay the sales tax, then we'll kind of run these reports, and those reports will help us to determine the tax liability for sales tax, meaning sales tax will typically go up when we generate sales that are taxes due on, such as create invoices and the sales receipt, increasing the sales tax. Then like the month after or some period after the tax is accumulated, for example, it goes up for 1 month, we might have to pay the sales tax in the following month, at which point we can use this widget to pay it off. And those reports can help us to determine what the sales tax is. Let's go back to the report. Again, we've got then the sales tax. We got the lists, the vendor phone list, which isn't really a financial report, but gives us our vendor list contact information and the contact detail, more detail, including addresses and so on. So that's the general idea with the vendor side of things. Typical idea being that you want to first think about the balance sheet here, saying this is supporting, these reports are all supporting the accounts payable, representing the fact that we owe people money. Then we want to break out who we owe the money to in various formats, including aging. How old are the items that we owe money to? And how likely are we to incur penalties and interest if we pay it late, or anger our vendors and anger or have some problems with our business relationships if we don't pay our bills then, and then try to pay our bills accordingly.